then we will begin. We will turn the balance of our time over to Andrew Tawfik, our speaker today from University of Memphis, a good friend, we hope, of our program. We believe so. He's got some interesting and forward-thinking ideas to share with us about learning experience design. So Andrew, we'll just turn the balance of the seminar now over to you.
Sounds good. Really quick question before I get started. You guys end at 12:50, is that, or I'm sorry, 1:50 or whatever it is. Yeah, 12:50 your time?
Yes.
Okay, cool. And so if I were to leave time for Q&A, it would be before that 12:50, right?
Yes.
Okay, sounds good. All right, well, I'll go ahead and get started. I want to thank you all for just allowing me to be here for this presentation. I work here at the University of Memphis, and I run a lab, and I'll talk a little bit about that here in a little bit. But we kind of joke internally within my lab and also some of my students that all roads lead to BYU. I've got a chance to publish with Dr. West. A number of my articles, or in my classes, I have courses from Jason and Heather, for her work in PBL. And so for whatever reason, we joke that we all seem to be kind of going back to the well that is BYU and just the strong program that y'all have there. So with that said, I'll go ahead and get started. I'm going to make this like a little bit maybe more interactive. One of the things that we'll find out here in a little bit is, as we kind of understand learning experience design, it's been kind of co-opted or borrowed, whatever the term that we might use, from other disciplines. And the reason why I say that is that there's a lot that we still don't know and we're still figuring out. And I'll even say that we're even still figuring out the definition of what is learning experience design. And I say that for a couple of different reasons. One, I think that there are still a lot of open questions out there. What is it? How do we capture it? What does that mean? Or whatever that might be. And related, like, what is the empirical research that supports that? And so I'll talk a little bit about that, but also as an opportunity, if I say anything that says, hey, I'm not really sure if that's true, given that learning experience design is a relatively new, I don't know if we might call it a paradigm or this idea, feel free to push back on something I said, or whether it's your own experience, or maybe you have experience and you're a practitioner, or a recent article that you may have seen. So with that said, I'll go ahead and get started. All right, can you all see my screen okay? I think I saw someone nod their head.
Yep.
All right, great, thank you so much. All right, so I've kind of entitled my talk today, LXD Theory and Practical Implications. So a little bit about myself, I'll kind of say just really briefly the elevator pitch version. I'm a faculty member at the University of Memphis. And as part of, in addition to teaching and research, I'm really fortunate that I get to run something we call the Instructional Design and Technology Studio. And so here we've got to work with Dr. Kimmons on some open educational resource stuff and some of the design development, especially around informal learning environments. And we developed some kind of equity resources and OER resources to be implemented within library settings to improve learning access. But another part of what we do is we do a lot of UX testing. And so part of that was driven by a couple different things. Prior to my time at University of Memphis, I served as an instructional designer in higher ed. So I worked as a corporate trainer. But another experience that kind of really resonated with me was when I was at the University of Missouri getting my doctorate. And they have a similar lab called Information Experience Lab, which is where I did my assistantship. And a lot of people would say, hey, we have this really awesome learning technology and it's going to revolutionize education. We've heard that many times, of course, but we bring it in and we say, we brought in different users and we're a little unclear about how to actually use it. And we would even do this in a number of different settings. So I remember I was working with some folks in the medical school and they had redesigned electronic medical records so doctors could get more up-to-date information. They had difficulty using it. And so that portion of design, that portion of instructional design really stuck with me. And I was trying to understand it a little bit more in some of the articles that our lab has published here at the Instructional Design and Technology Studio, has been in pursuit of trying to understand what exactly it is and why it actually matters. And so, so I have a couple open questions that I wanted to ask you on. Please feel free to jump in. I'm curious, maybe kind of the first question is content alone enough? And so if I can kind of maybe give you like an example, I know, Dr. Larry is here on the call. If I were designing like a problem-based learning module and I had really great scaffolds and I embedded those different scaffolds that help me to understand alternative perspectives and the evidence for doing things. Going back, I saw Dr. West, and then we have badges to be able to do some of those things. If I were to design those and provide all the content there on a screen, maybe 2 screens, do you feel like that would be an effective learning technology? And there's no right or wrong answer. I'm just curious, y'all's thoughts on it. If we make it accessible, if we provide it in an interface, can we expect learners to actually understand those concepts in a reasonable way?
So Andrew, I'll jump in real quick. I think it's interesting, this question of is content enough? I think if we go back to just even, cognitive load theory, this idea of extraneous load, it's not just about making something prettier, although that's not a bad thing either, right? If we make something prettier or more fun to do, then people are going to be more likely to want to do it. But it's also just that if we just get some of the extraneous load out of the way, they're going to be able to learn better.
Yeah. Yeah, and a lot of extraneous cognitive load, it's kind of looked at some of these other things. Sometimes they call them the seductive details, like all this extra stuff. And then, there's also the interaction component. But I really like what you also talk about, where you kind of bring this idea of engagement. There's maybe the more like affective realm, like motivation, self-efficacy, and all that kind of stuff, where there are other parts to learning. And maybe there's this other part that we might add on to it called learning experience design. Here's another question. Actually, this question was posed to me a little bit ago with a colleague here at the University of Memphis, and he had asked us to kind of do their learning experience done on a grant that they had. And this question like really stuck with me because I never really considered it before. And I'm curious, like y'all's thoughts on this, and how can we make UX better when learning is inherently about challenging understanding? So if you think about like cognitive disequilibrium, right, there needs to be some kind of point of confusion. And I feel like he wasn't necessarily pushing back on our assessment of learning technology, but we were saying like it has to be more efficient, it has to be better and all that kind of stuff. But he's saying, but our learning technology is designed to make something challenging. You have to challenge that conceptual understanding. And so I'm curious for maybe others on the call, how we might kind of reconcile those ideas. There is kind of like a messiness to learning, especially for those that are interested in like complex problem solving. But oh, by the way, the learning technology has to be smooth and easy to understand and really efficient. Those almost seem like dichotomous with each other, or we're talking out of both sides of our mouth. And so I'm curious, like if maybe others have ran into this issue before, or maybe thoughts. I have some ideas about maybe how to answer that, but I want to hear other people's thoughts first.
Got a couple in the chat there.
Okay.
In terms of, I agree with Dr. Rich there. The challenge should be conceptual understanding, not in how it's presented. But I guess in some ways you could present something on the screen that would elicit disequilibrium. But I don't know how. I would think people might be too frustrated with that, maybe. I don't know.
Right. Yeah, and absolutely. Like it can be, really challenging to get it just right, just enough disequilibrium, but not to have it too much. Present challenging as things that challenge their prior knowledge, but it's all being presented on that same interface. And I think that's the really challenging. That's the real challenge. Whenever we distinguish it with something that's more general, like just UX, that's the unique aspects of learning experience design. And then lastly, I'll kind of like jump in a little bit after this, but if it does matter, to what degree does it actually matter? Is it kind of like, when I tell my kids, you should really eat your fruits and vegetables, please try and do that. Or does it actually like really, 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 really matter? And if we don't get it right now, it'll be really problematic over time. And so those are some of the things that our lab has been looking at, I think when people that think about learning experience design, they're trying to think about content, yes, but also what's going on as we design some of these different learning technologies. So with that said, did y'all, I don't want to belabor us too much, but did you all get a chance to watch this video? I think I shared it in some of the materials. Maybe not. So maybe what I'll just really kind of briefly show this video, and maybe we won't go through it all in the interest of time. But here's like kind of a video that's designed to show how microbes affect our brains and behavior. And so I won't play maybe the whole thing, but it's about maybe like a minute or two.
We co-evolved with trillions of microorganisms comprised of bacteria, viruses, fungi, and other microbes. Their estimated populations are staggering. A whopping 100 trillion bacteria live in our gut, 10 billion in our mouths, and another 1 trillion on our skin. The belly button alone contains dozens of unique species. Microbes inhabit every exposed body surface, even the extremely acidic and harsh environment of the stomach. With a surface area of about 32 square meters, the gastrointestinal tract is the largest interface between us and our environment. It contains the highest number and diversity of the microbiome. Collectively, these microbes would weigh a hefty 2 to 6 pounds, up to twice the weight of an average adult.
So I'll go in and discuss a little bit about why I think that is really helpful. It's kind of when I think about learning experience design. When I looked at that, I thought the design, I'm kind of struck by something Andy Gibbons said a little bit ago. He said, we've been so focused on the instruction part that we've missed the design part. I know for me, I'm kind of more interested in like the cognitive side of things. I oftentimes miss about just making my designs look, engaging and all those different things. And when I look at that design, I think, wow, like I thought someone did a really great job with the aesthetics, and all the content is there. But there was so much information happening at a particular time. There was something about the microbes, and I think they said something about microbes on the tongue and different parts of the body. But exactly, if I needed to go back, because that information is new to me, and I need to go back, how would I go back and be able to understand some of those things and actually retain that information? Or, if I wanted to maybe reconcile something else that happens later on, in the video with something new that kind of sounds similar, and I need to be able to help it understand it from like my mental model, I wouldn't be able to do that. I have to restart that video all over again. And so even though it was engaging, even though the content was there, and they did things really well from the cognitive perspective, again, all that information, the more aesthetics, like that engagement piece, it was still challenging if I really wanted to actually use it as a learning resource that would help me along the way. And so that's kind of the example that I want to show you, and maybe why that example might be helpful. One of the things that we kind of talk a little bit is user-centered design. And this term may or may not be familiar to you, but I might talk about it here in a little bit. You guys are probably familiar with ADDIE, the analysis, design, development, implementation, and evaluation. And I've done different ADDIE projects along the way, and what's interesting about ADDIE is first you implement it and then you evaluate it as part of it. But user-centered design is a little bit different in that it says that there's these different parts of it, but as soon as you're in one stage, you're always kind of like looking back, and you're always willing to revisit some of those prior stages. And so even though you're like, okay, tomorrow is our implementation day, you're always willing to say, hey, we got some additional user feedback, and now we need to kind of rethink some of our approaches, and we need to design. So in that case, it's very iterative, it's very circular, and you're always kind of going back to the drawing board. You're always willing to be able to do that. And so another thing, I mentioned this kind of implicitly, is that the users are coming alongside you. You are trying to say, hey, what can we actually do? I know some stuff from a design perspective. I know this scaffolding model. I know I'm designing for online learning, and here's a really great theory that will help me think about it. And a lot of times I've designed things. I mentioned kind of this informal learning curriculum, and I designed some things and I was pretty sure that I got it right, and we wanted to implement it. And we brought in users and they said, this is totally confusing. I have no idea what's going on. And so the designers are walking alongside the users along the way. And so one question I have for you, and I'm curious y'all's thoughts, Henry Ford may or may not have said this, but he said, supposedly, is that if I had asked people what they wanted, they would have said faster horses. Or if I were to maybe kind of think about this like in a user-centered design perspective, is users may not know exactly what they want. And so if we were to maybe think about this quote, we actually had class yesterday, some are questioning, well, what if the users don't know what they want? Or what if they want something that's completely, what I think is totally wrong, and it's their version of just faster horses. And so, I'm curious, like y'all's thoughts, if you've ever run into this and how we might kind of reconcile this. Yes, bring users alongside, but users might get it wrong. I'm curious y'all's thoughts on that.
It seems like if you have users working alongside you while you're designing, that you can present new ideas that they may not have considered something besides faster horses, and they can react to it, and they can see that there is a different way. And if it has potential, then they can help you know how that can be further developed.
Absolutely. I totally agree. And I think also as part of that, I really appreciate that you brought that up, is it highlights just the importance of rapid prototyping. A lot of times in the design and development stage, I kind of have a good idea about like what my design will look like, and I'll try and really flush it out, and then present it to the users, and they either love it or they want to provide some feedback. But maybe if I can provide 2 or 3 different options of what the users might want, and then I might be able to kind of present them, with different options, and they might be able to think about the problem or the learning technology that's presented from them a little bit differently. And maybe then that user-centered design, I'm actually getting to what would actually be beneficial to them, not just what they think they want or what I think they want. And so I think that just speaks to the importance of being able to prototype early and often, and presenting users with multiple options. So I'm going to go ahead and kind of move along. When I think about user experience design, this maybe gets a little bit to the question that I had presented earlier. It's interesting because I feel like learning experience design, there's different parts of it. There's kind of like the engagement as we look at learning technologies, also the ability to use it in a functional way. But when our lab was doing a literature review around this topic, it's interesting because it was hiding in plain sight in different articles that we came across, but there was no kind of consensus around it. And so Lee and colleagues said, usability is critical to the development of a user-friendly digital textbook platform interface. Yet thorough research on interface development based on usability principles is in short supply. And so this was about a decade ago. Mills said, and colleagues said, in order for designers of educational software to maximize learning, they need to understand the interactions among design features, non-cognitive states, and aspects of learner. And so I think that this kind of speaks out learner experience design that we had talked about a little bit earlier. And a little bit more recently, Novak and her colleagues said, despite growing body of research in the area of digital learning and information processing, the literature on how people process and interact with information on electronic devices and computers is still very scarce. In this case, she's talking about those interactions, especially kind of like that human-computer interaction. We might also call it learning experience design. So it's interesting that we are talking about, these ideas. We're all kind of acknowledging about, what it more or less entails. And yeah, this other person should probably do this kind of research. It would be, really cool if we do that. But it's still an open question in the literature. And so one of the things that I've kind of argued, and I know there's like a lot of reading on here, I want to kind of go into it, is that I think the UX component of learning experience design is kind of implicit within other theories and models that we use a lot in our field. So the technology acceptance model, they talk about this idea of perceived ease of use. More recently, I think it's been called effort expectancy. You know, if someone's going to actually adopt a particular technology, make sure that it's really easy to use and there's kind of a dedicated construct to that. If people are more like in the cognitive load literature, it might be on this idea of extraneous cognitive load, you know, like it might be too complex, and navigation can be part of it. There's also kind of a theoretical approach called pedagogical usability, where they're looking at a little bit more of the technical parts and just make sure that everything's working. And so for better or for worse in higher ed is that, you know, people in academia, we focus on these theories or these approaches to learning, technology acceptance model, or another researcher looks at cognitive load and so on, and we become very siloed, you know, within these different theoretical frameworks. And so what we're arguing is that I think that there's all this evidence kind of sprinkled around other theoretical models. Is there anything that we can abstract? Are we seeing some patterns in the research and say, hey, here's what learning experience design actually entails? And so with that, I'm going to just maybe present like kind of two different studies where it really resonated for me about, wow, I might need learning experience design a little bit more than I think that I do. And then some of the latter studies talk about, if I am going to try and understand learning experience design, maybe I might need some different types of measurements and different ways of kind of thinking about it. Maybe I can't just give people a test score or a self-efficacy survey at the end. If I think I'm looking at a different part of that learning experience, maybe I need to capture it and measure it differently to be able to really understand it. And I have some ideas, and I'm curious to y'all's thoughts on it as well. And so the first thing is, again, trying to understand what is learning experience design. And so there's all this idea about usability or human computer interaction, or, you know, some of these things. But I wanted to kind of find out what was the more empirical way of looking, you know, at some of these things. So I want to maybe share a little bit about some of my prior research. One of the research that I've been interested in over time is case-based reasoning. I don't want to kind of bore you with the details about that, but case-based reasoning basically says is we use our prior experience to solve new problem. And so if you follow different theorists that have looked at case-based reasoning, like Janet Kolodner or Roger Schenck, David Jonasson, they said, well, if that's the case, when you're doing some kind of a problem-based learning module, what you can do is you can embed prior experiences, other stories about how other people tried to solve it. And then that can kind of scaffold them, present them with different models. And as they try and solve it themselves, they'll able to say, oh, I remember this other case, and now I'm going to be able to do better in that problem-based learning module. And so we had kind of set up, a colleague and I, we had set up a learning technology around case-based reasoning. We did everything right from that theoretical perspective, and I'm pretty sure we knocked it out of the park. And I was really confident about that until I actually saw what their learning outcomes were, and they did not do very well at all. And I was like, but I'm pretty sure I did everything right from a case-based reasoning theory perspective. And so on the bottom is kind of like this was the instructor, and this was his concept map. But on the top is what the students had actually turned in. So you see a lot less nodes. It's not really as well thought out. And so I was kind of going back to the literature and say, is there something else that I can be doing from the design? And I said, well, maybe I just had a really bad, maybe my human computer interaction, my learning experience design was really poor. And maybe I need to rethink what that looks like. And so one of the things that we did as a follow-up study on the left is what that case-based reasoning module or that problem-based learning module looked at. So there's this narrative, and then the blue are links to related cases. Again, we're doing everything right by that particular theory, but we kind of looked at the Google Analytics side of things. And we tried to track where are people going along the way. And so they were, and if you can see here, they were on that main landing page, and they were on then the starting page. Their first interaction was basically refreshing that main page. And very quickly, they didn't really operate from those different things. And what we wanted them to do is we wanted them to look at some of the scaffolds along the way. They're here, like Alex's selection, There's 3 more pages that are even less used. But a lot of this was around the assignment description, 1 or 2 maybe around the actual scaffolds. And so the Google Analytics showed us that while we had embedded all these different scaffolds and tried to design it really well, but people are just not using it in the way that we intended. And so it was interesting that the colleague and I that we were working on, we kept the content more or less the same. All we did was we changed the learning experience design. And so in this case, we actually tried to break things up a little bit more. We tried to understand their UX patterns, what would prompt them to that next interaction and keep them interested and keep them engaged. And if we are to try and break it up in a little bit way, can they navigate to the different parts of the learning environment in an efficient way? And then when we ran the Google Analytics there, I know it's impossible to see, but you can see it's much more uniform. You didn't see these big gaps where people were going to one page and then very, very small after it, where they're not really looking at these different pages. It's much more uniform into like where they were going. And in our case, the different narratives that they were looking at. And so this really highlighted for me. So we more or less kept everything the same. All we did was you check the learning experience design. And as we looked at also the concept maps improved. And again, it's that idea that earlier question that I posed is, is it just content, or are there other parts that can really impact learning outcomes? In this case, it led us to believe that was the case. We need to look beyond just the content approach. The other part that I wanted to look at, I know this is really messy, but we'll get into this here in a little bit. This was actually the colleague that had posed this idea to me about, isn't learning supposed to be kind of intentionally hard, and there's kind of a rub there in cognitive disequilibrium? If we make this learning technology so fluid and so efficient, are we doing a disservice to other theoretical parts or other different parts of learning that we think that we know? And so this is actually trying to teach electrical engineering students about the different parts around circuits, transistors, and some of these different things. And we said, well, if we have some evidence to believe that the learning experience design is really important, what if we did like eye tracking to see what people are looking at and trying to be able to understand like kind of what is their learning experience design? And so I know, again, like this is really messy, but it was really interesting just look at the different ways and kind of the different eye tracking pieces that people were looking at and being able to interpret their learning experience design. We have some qualitative data to help us triangulate or trying to help us kind of parse through what this actually is. But I'm curious for y'all's thoughts as you look at this. Does this tell us anything about learning experience design? Does it tell us anything about how learners are actually using this type of technology? Yeah, in other words, like how might we interpret this? All right, well, I'll maybe like kind of jump in and share a little bit about our interpretation, and then you can tell us if you agree with us or disagree. This one is, I think, one in particular that I wanted to really highlight. This is something called like a sequential analysis. Whenever you're using an eye tracking software, it's like, again, it's impossible to see, but there are numbers here that are part of it. So you can say, first the person went here, and then they went here, and then they went back, and these lines help to kind of show you that. And if you really wanted to, you can actually track the numbers over time. But when we put the learners and we said, how would you actually use this type of learning technology? How would you complete this particular task? And you see here that kind of these bubbles got bigger over time, which means that they were spending more time on those different parts of it. And there's all these crisscrossing going on. And so they were trying to understand it, but they were looking at the menu structure over here, and they were expending all these cognitive resources just trying to find the answer embedded in there. And there was a number of clicks there just to do something as simple, as simple as finding information. And so here you can see that the circles are a lot bigger on this side, but they're a lot smaller over here. This is the part where learning is supposed to be happening. but they're focusing here just because the learning experience design was really poor. But and also we kind of like saw it in different places as well, where we this is an artificial intelligence bot. People were kind of looking back and forth, trying to figure things out. There were other resources that were needed, but they were completely ignored. And that was really interesting to say, well, there's all this repository of knowledge, in this case, this AI bot, but it's not looked at all. And other parts of the design, or other people looked at it in a more efficient way, or in a more uniform way, where they're looking here and they're also looking here. They're looking at the content and trying to fill out the answer. And so again, as we kind of think about, why is learning experience design, what exactly it is, we're not just trying to say it because it would be a really interesting thing to look at. We think that, especially this one here on the top left, is that it would really impact the actual learning outcomes, right? We're designing these learning technologies and we're so focused on what is the activity and what are the resources, but if we don't design it in the right way, if we don't understand what that interaction actually entails, it'll actually probably end up more confusing and, be like kind of a waste of resources. And so that interaction piece is a really critical component of design. And so I'm going to talk really briefly, and I want to be able to open it up for questions in a little bit. So one of the things that our lab and I, as a part of this, we tried to propose a working definition of learning experience design, where we said that design is you are simultaneously interacting with two different parts, and there should be a confluence. There should be these things should go hand in hand with one another. On the one hand, you're interacting with the learning environment, and as you think about what those interactions should entail, the parts that would really help them, learners want to be able to customize the interface. They want to see the value of the functionality. They want the content to be placed in just the right way. The interface terms should be, aligned with their expectations, and the navigation should be fluid. And as they interact with the different parts that are more directly tied with learning, they want the modality, like the multimedia and some of these different things. They want that to be presented in the right way that's of interest to them, and it's really easy to use. If you're kind of familiar with Jonathan's mind tools, but if there's a feature in there that's supposed to help them with that, they want to say, I see how this is actually beneficial for my learning. They need to be able to understand that really quickly. We also introduced kind of this idea of dynamic interaction, kind of this back and forth, where learners are actually being taken to the next stage of their learning. It's not just that they're going to the next level of their zone of proximal development, but the interaction is actually being sustained along the way, and the interface is kind of providing them information back along the way that helps to kind of keep them going within that learning environment. And lastly, there needs to be specific interactions that directly scaffold, their gaps in knowledge. And so maybe like in the interest of time, I won't do study 3, but I'll just kind of briefly talk about it. We looked at this that prior study was looked at it in the context of engineering. We said, but are there other aspects of learning experience design that we might not understand? And so we got some funding to be able to do some LX testing on an HBCU, a historically Black college and university out in the Northeast. This is funded by the National Science Foundation, where there's a mentor and a mentee, and where they're trying to kind of help them because some women of color tend to drop out, especially in STEM fields, and we're trying to build learning technology that would help address that. But one of the things that we're also talking about is we're trying to understand different learner characteristics that plays a role, especially around their goals and attributes and prior experiences, which impacts how they actually use the technology. But I do want to leave time for question and answer, or maybe kind of a further discussion about some of these different things. And so, and kind of the earlier on is, I asked, is content alone? How can we make better UX when learning is inherently about challenging our prior understanding? But then there are other parts, as we think about, well, what about virtual reality? What about broader socio-technical systems? When this happens in a more collaborative setting, what does that interaction look like? And so as much as I think that we're starting to gain some clarity as to what are the constructs, or what are some of the different parts of learning experience design, think there's still a lot more research to be known as we look at different populations and different types of technology to be able to understand what is that learning experience design. So I wanted to kind of leave time for questions. I know I kind of went quickly at the end, but does anyone have any questions or comments, or maybe their own prior experiences where they're trying to do some LX testing? I could try to share a lot of my own experiences, but I'm curious, like, if anyone have found something similar or different.
I have a question. I'm a web developer, and so I handle the programming side of things often. How do you handle the trade-off between the desire of designers and users to add features and the developer's desire to reduce complexity? Because with every single maybe button that you add or input you add, you're adding complexity to the whole system. Have you dealt with that? Is that something that comes up, or do you just kind of let it go?
Yeah, so I do think you bring up a good point, because anytime we put something there on the interface, it's just one more thing for the learner to have to process at a given time, right? If we only present two different options to them, they only have to make one choice between A or B. But if we put another feature and then another feature and another feature, all of a sudden that learning experience design can be more challenging. And then they're navigating and crisscrossing the learning technology. That's really difficult. I think one of the things that I tend to do, it's maybe isn't the answer that you'd be looking for, but I tend to think through what the user wants at that particular time. I have worked with developers, especially like in medical education, where we said, well, is there a scaled down version of what we can provide to the learner? How much do they actually need it? But there are kind of limitations, especially as we've dealt with understanding the kind of learning experience design from a mobile perspective. And in some of those things where there's only so much real estate and there's only so much computing power to be able to support some of those different things. Good question.
Kind of a follow-up question to that, addressing the idea of complexity. You mentioned that it's important for the learner to understand right away what's going to be necessary for their learning or helpful for their learning quickly. How do you do that? Are you talking about like in a course as a whole, or in every individual interaction or page or things like that? And without like making things so complex and trying to put everything all in one place so they don't miss it.
Right. I think one of the things that's here, it's maybe like not the most, fanciest thing, but one of the things that's really helpful for me to think about is like in terms of like, I'm sorry, I'm rambling. When I think about a task analysis and I think about what are those broad tasks and what are those subtasks. And so when I think about like a complex interaction, I say, how can I get from one big task and not worry so much about the subtask? But when I think about one big task to the next big subtask, is that really clear for the learner to be able to progress from one to the other? And so I kind of, when I try and map out my different interactions, I'm mapping between those those broader tasks, so that learners know where to start and they can know where to go to the next thing. And if they need to, maybe circle back to it as well. Now within the subtasks, I'm thinking about those interactions about how can I develop them? How can they kind of crisscross within those different subtasks? But as I think about mapping things out broader, I'm kind of thinking about those broader tasks along the way. Does that make sense?
Yes, thank you.
I want to ask a question, piggybacking on what Stephanie said. And what Steve said, you talk about in your paper about perceptions and student perceptions. So how do you calculate, is this by your reiteration of when they actually just first look at it and their perceptions deciding whether it's hard or difficult or not? And how do you navigate for those perceptions that users may find when they first approach the software or the learning experience?
Mm-hmm. So is the question, when learners first, are using that learner technology, how do we maybe can you clarify the question a little bit? I want to make sure I'm understanding. I apologize.
Well, in your paper, you talked about perceptions in the paper, and you know, between, you were talking about the content placement and the interface terms and their perceptions. And if
Mhm.
it could be misaligned with what they're seeing, so then
Right.
they don't have that learning experience, or it's lessened.
Mhm. Right. And so one of the things that is really helpful, this maybe goes back to that first or second slide, is doing kind of a user-centered design to understand what are the perceptions that my users will be bringing in when they are using a particular learning technology. What is terminology that would be really relevant to them, that might not be appropriate in another context. If I can kind of like give as an example, I mentioned, and this is a big shout out to Dr. Kimmons, but he was helping us a lot with the learning experience design for this informal STEM learning stuff that we were doing, that we're looking to implement in underserved areas of Memphis. And so we had to spend a lot of time saying, well, what are those perceptions of those kids within those particular contexts? Because my perception might be different than what theirs are. I'm designing from my particular perspective or my particular perceptions, and then I'm kind of baking that into the different learning technologies. But that's why it was really important for us to do the user-centered design and get a broad different perspective from different stakeholders. We looked at librarians that might actually be implementing those within those different contexts. We looked at kids as well. And so being able to tackle and being able to really understand what those perceptions are, we felt like the only way to be able to do it was doing some user-centered design early on, especially in the prototyping stages.
Thank you.
Any other comments or questions?
I have a question. Can you expand a little bit on, I'm fascinated with the difference between the learning environment versus the learning space, particularly in an online course or an online training, or however we're doing that. How do you know where you're at and where you should be, for lack of more eloquence?
Yeah, I'm trying to think of like a really eloquent way to say that, to avoid saying I'm not totally sure a lot of times. One of the things that we try and argue in the paper is that there's a confluence between the two. Instead of thinking about where I'm at a given time, I maybe think about it as like different sides of the same coin, where it's really hard to divorce or separate these two particular features. Because anytime as the learner are operating within these different things, they're probably operating in both spaces at the same time. They're trying to maybe navigate as they're trying to evaluate, as they're trying to engage with the different modalities, or as they're trying to also engage in dynamic interaction. And so I think one of the things that we've tried to think about, as well as when we think about our design, is if we tend to focus a little bit more on the learning space first. And I say, if I'm still designing some of these things, if I'm thinking about modality, if I'm thinking about these different mind tools, how to sustain interaction, am I also supporting the interaction with the learning environment piece as well? If they need to, as part of it, can we allow for customization? Can we allow for fluid navigation? And so I guess maybe as I'm talking about this, I might start a little bit more with the learning space first, because that's really the task at hand that needs to be done, while making sure that I'm not, while I'm also being mindful of that interaction with the learning environment. Does that answer your question?
That was very helpful. Thanks.
Yeah. One of the things maybe also to share a little bit while we're talking about that is, I think that knowing like where to operate at any given time has been challenging for us. As we've done like different studies, it seems again like we've tried to look at the starting with the learning space and just making sure that also these interactions with learning environments, that we're also mindful of these different things. And other things that we're trying to do is we're trying to look at some kind of empirical testing as to we have like this grant that we're working with where we've looking at like Jupyter notebooks, and we're trying to understand kind of different learners, different UX patterns over time to say, are they focusing on more the learning environment pieces like customization, functionality, and some of these other things, or do they spend more time operating within the learning space? So I think your question is an open question that we're trying to deal with in the lab, and we're trying to gain a little bit more clarity around. And we're trying to look at it from a big data perspective to kind of understand what is broader UX patterns.
I don't want to jump here with so many questions, but I'm curious, the triangulation with qualitative data, what the purpose for that was just you want to get other perspectives on why they might have been looking where they were looking, or is there other confounds in the eye tracking research? And so you do need other data so you can kind of get a sense of whether they were looking there because they're just kind of zoning out, whether they're looking there because they're really interested in that. And that's kind of what I'm wondering.
Yeah, I think, for people that are interested in UX in any different field, and also learning experience design is, if you were to focus on something for a long time, let me see if I can kind of pull up that data. Does that mean that you're really interested in it? Or does it mean that you're really confused with it? So if you were to look at something with like an eye tracking data, if I were to just look at that, I'm potentially at bias, especially if it's something that I really want to design. If it's something that I design, I'm pretty sure that it's because the students are really interested in it and it's a sign of really great engagement. If it's maybe someone else's design, maybe it's that they're really confused and it's a sign that learning experience design is really difficult. And so when we're able to kind of sit with the user and do a cognitive task analysis, where they're, especially in the think aloud approach, where they're telling us along the way, like in the top left, they said, I can't really find this information and I don't really know what to do. So that's really difficult. And that was really helpful, just to make sure that we didn't go swing the pendulum too far in our interpretation of one data source, but we're being mindful of other ones as well.
Makes sense. Thank you.
That's a good question. But your question though, actually, if I can maybe like elaborate on that a little bit, I had some colleagues that I meet periodically with about this idea of learning experience design. One of the things that we want to look at more is to be able to have more sound measures of learning experience design, and being able to say, if you want to understand like this part of the learning experience, you should probably gravitate towards this data collection. If you want a different part of learning experience design, it would lend itself well to a different type of measure. I think it's very easy for me to gravitate towards, again, learning test scores or survey measures or some of these different things. We don't really have a lot of clarity as to what are again, what are the different parts of learning experience design and what are associated measures with that. And I think that there needs to be a lot more research in that regard.
Okay, Andrew, I think we will call it here. We're just a few seconds away from our stop time. Thank you so much for spending your afternoon with us. Students, if you join me in thanking Andrew for his time today. We're so grateful for your willingness to share these thoughts and insights for us. Students, we will conclude our seminar now. We will be back again next week, so we'll look forward to seeing you then.
Thanks, everyone.